Today, I'm going to talk about what I think no-gi grapplers can learn by training in the gi more often. Hey everybody, welcome back to another Q&A. My name's Paul Federici. I am a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt under PJ O'Sullivan. I train at Apura Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy in Hamilton, Ontario, as well as Parabellum MMA in Oakville, Ontario, and I'm here today to answer some of your questions. If this is the first time you've been to this channel, please take a second to click the subscribe button below, and if you're already a subscriber, please click that little bell icon next to it, turn notifications on, and that way you'll be notified every time I release a new video. This is a follow-up video. I had a question last week from Let There Be Justice, and Justice asks, what can gi grapplers learn from doing no gi and vice versa? Great question, Justice. Thanks again for sending it my way. I did a video last week. I'm going to post a link right here. And I talk in that video about the benefits that I think gi grapplers can learn by doing no gi more often, but today I'm going to talk about the reverse of that. We're going to look at the other side of the coin because I do believe there is value in training both styles of jiu-jitsu. Okay, so like the last time, let's take a student that trains pretty much primarily no gi, and let's throw the gi on them, bring them to their first class. What are they going to see and what are they going to learn training in the gi more often? Well, as the opposite of what we talked about last time, now when they train in the gi, there's obviously going to be a ton of friction and there's going to be grips and handles everywhere, okay? And so I think what that generally means is that it's much easier to establish a connection to your opponent and to maintain control of your opponent. So there's generally a lot less sweat, it's easier to restrain your opponent, and it's generally much harder to move as freely as you usually can no-gi. In some ways, I feel that the gi can be a bit of an equalizer from a physical perspective, meaning that you can't necessarily rely on physical attributes quite as much as you can in no-gi. Because you can get slowed down a little bit more easily with these grips, it tends to sort of negate speed, explosiveness, agility, those sorts of things a little bit more. And what I think this tends to develop in gi grapplers is more of a refined ability to escape positions and submissions in a more technical and methodical way, okay? So sometimes in no-gi, I find that people can rely on slipperiness and explosiveness. For example, sometimes when people are in an arm lock, sometimes they can just sort of really explosively pull their elbow out and clear the elbow line, and suddenly they're free of the submission without really dedicating as much sort of thought or nuance to what they're doing. It's just sort of a 1, 2, 3, explode, and they're out of danger. Whereas in the gi, because things are slowed down and there's so much friction and so many handles, it tends not to work the same way. I don't think that this is the case in all situations. There are examples where I think the handles of the gi can create problems with defense as well, because, for example, sometimes when I train in the gi and I might be having someone attacking my arm, a lot of times what I'll do is reach into my own collar and grab it. So now suddenly I have a second free hand to maybe pass their leg over my head or start to turn out or defend. And so in that instance, that could be a negative if I were to go to no-gi and suddenly that handle's gone. Now my defensive skills are subpar. But generally speaking, I think that people do tend to develop a bit more technical and refined positional escapes and submission escapes. So I do think people that train in the gi, their defensive skills tend to be a little bit more refined, especially when it comes to the neck, because in no-gi, you tend to obviously worry about things like darces, guillotines, anacondas, rear naked choke, triangles, which are all available in the gi, but now you have all these handles, and so in a lot of positions, you might find your neck being under attack from angles and positions that you're just not familiar with. A good example of that is in back control. A lot of times I find in no-gi, when people get to back control, they can really sell out and just protect against the rear naked choke. Whereas in the gi, you might have people that are threatening the rear naked choke, but if they get a collar grip, they can attack things like bow and arrow chokes or Ezekiel chokes or all kinds of interesting submissions. So I do think people's neck defense tends to be tighter, and they learn that sort of vulnerability of the neck very early in jiu-jitsu because of the gi and the handles. I do think you could argue too that training in the gi is possibly a more realistic scenario when it comes to sort of a self-defense perspective, only because in no-gi, the attire is very different and the rules are different. So in no-gi, everybody tends to wear, board shorts, spats, rash guards, and you're not allowed to grab your opponent's material when you're passing, when you're submitting, when you're defending. And so I think that's a bit more unrealistic because no matter what somebody's wearing, whether it's shorts, a tank top, a sweater, a jacket, in a street altercation or self-defense scenario, you're always going to be able to sort of grab your opponent's clothing, whether in an offensive or defensive way. So I think if you're not used to that aspect, that can really surprise you when somebody starts to use your own clothes against you, or find ways to pass your guard with grips that you're not used to. So I do think that putting on the gi can help no-gi grapplers become more aware of some of the things that they're missing by not being allowed to grab sort of any material or fabric. The other thing too I find is that it's less sweaty in the gi generally, or at least the material absorbs the sweat, so the mats don't tend to get quite as slippery as they do in no-gi. I know in the summer at Parabellum, things get incredibly hot, and the mats become sort of like a pool. It's like rolling on a wet banana, and so there's an element to that I think becomes pretty unrealistic because it becomes virtually impossible to maintain any position or any submission because it's just so slick. The second thing I would say is that I think I would make the argument that there's more depth to the guard game in the gi, and there's more opportunity for guard work because you can isolate positions more, okay? So the only reason I say that there's more depth to the guard game is because I made the argument in the last video that anything you can do no-gi, you can do in the gi, okay? So it only makes sense then to say that if we take all the skills we learned in no-gi and now we suddenly add a bunch of handles, it just adds sort of, an infinite number of possibilities in terms of the way that you can attack from off your back. You take people like Keenan Cornelius, for example, who are real innovators in the sport, constantly developing new lapel guards, worm guards, all those sorts of things. Those are things you're just not going to see in no-gi because you don't have the material or the fabric to do that. And because of the grips and the fact that gi is more methodical, I think you can stay kind of locked into positions for longer periods of time than you can in no-gi. I made the argument in the last video that in no-gi, you become more adept at scrambling and making quicker decisions because things move faster. So naturally in the gi, you could find yourself stuck or isolated in a position for a much longer period of time. Like, for example, if I pulled De La Riva guard, for example, and I had a very strong cross collar and a sleeve or a pant grip, your opponent can't simply just retreat out of that. They're going to have to be more methodical, and it's going to take longer for your opponent to start to pass your guard. Whereas if I pulled some sort of De La Riva in no-gi, my opponent could simply just kick out and retreat. And so I think with that reality, it gives people more time to sit and stare in a position and think about it a little bit slower, and it gives them a bit more time to react and to develop sort of offensive sequences from that. You could also then make the same argument, I think, that there's more depth in passing in the gi as well, again, simply because grips mean more options, okay? So whatever we do in no-gi, knee cut passing or leg pummeling or whatever it may be, pressure passing, speed passing, we can all do that in the gi as well, but now we have a ton of handles. So it does make sense to say that I think there's more depth and refined guard passing work in the gi because of that. I find too that in the gi, passing has become highly specialized, right? Because of all the innovation with lapel guards and sleeves and grips, each of these new positions tends to require a more specialized approach to passing. For example, if you take something like that you wouldn't see in no-gi, like a lasso grip, right? That's not something you have to deal with in no-gi, but it can be incredibly frustrating and difficult to deal with in the gi. And if you're used to using sort of a knee cut style of passing where you're able to use athleticism and sweat to cut through somebody's guard, you can't just do that while you have somebody with this lasso grip. You have to have a more methodical and I do believe technical way of addressing some of these grips before you can then proceed to some of the passing styles that you're used to. Even in a passing style like the knee cut, for example, again, sweat and lack of handles can make that an easier thing to accomplish no-gi because you might be able to use, again, speed to drive through and cut through someone's half guard, whereas in the gi, not only is it more difficult because your opponent has handles, they can grab your sleeve, they can grab your collar, but just the very nature of the pants themselves make the friction, it makes it more difficult to simply knee cut and pass through some of these guards. I know that when I get used to playing no-gi a little bit more and I go back to the gi and there's less sweat, suddenly you find yourself more restricted, even if your opponent doesn't have any other grips but clamping their thighs together to sort of trap your ankle or your leg in half guard. That can actually present a much more difficult scenario because you're used to having sweat and sort of less friction to slide through. Eddie Bravo loves to wear gi pants even though he does no gi because he says it makes his half guard game significantly more effective, which is kind of weird to me. I've never understood that about Eddie, how he is all about no-gi, but then wants to wear the gi pants because it makes his game more effective. But anyways, that's a whole other discussion, but there is a bit of a caveat to this as well. So I do think that while people in the gi tend to develop a more refined and very sort of highly specialized guard passing skill set, it can be a problem if your passing style then becomes incredibly dependent on gi grips. I know, for example, the way that some people approach leg dragging, it's very dependent on having that pant grip to really pull the leg across, which again, when you get into a sweaty situation in no-gi and that's gone, suddenly the leg drag can appear like a completely different pass. I've also noticed that a lot of people that like to do long step style passing, for example, where they grab sort of a collar and the pant and they switch their hips and like to drive that leg back and base out, it works in the gi because of the grips. But if you take away those handles, the minute you go to long step, you're opening up a tremendous amount of space in no-gi, and better grapplers are just going to scramble out of it, and you may end up on the bottom. So again, like a lot of my opinions on this is that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and I think that developing a skill set that's more universal is really important as opposed to becoming so specialized in one or the other that you're sort of limited in your ability to grapple in different scenarios. The other thing that I think somebody coming from no-gi to gi can learn is that there's less leg locks in the gi. And you might say to yourself, well, I thought I thought you were a leg lock advocate. And I am. I think people should be learning these things much earlier. But like I said, I'm more of a middle ground kind of person. And I do believe that a lot of modern no-gi players do fall in love a bit too much with leg attacks at the expense of developing other skills. Most gyms tend to follow kind of this IBJJF rule set standard. And because of that, I think that there's less emphasis placed on leg locks, partially out of a sort of a cultural piece. They've kind of been a bit taboo, but also because winning in the IBJJF a lot of times, especially at high level in the gi, tends to become these really sort of methodical positional battles, and it's often won on points or an advantage. And so because there's less focus on leg locks, and because there's more of a value placed on this positional hierarchy, I do believe that a lot of gi gyms and gi schools tend to develop a universal skill set, which I believe is sweeping, passing, getting to the back, and positional control. Okay, so that can be an incredibly good thing. I've seen plenty of gyms that don't do that much no-gi, but you can throw them in almost any rule set and they do well because they have a really good refined sensibility about how to sweep an opponent from a variety of positions, how to pass the guard, and how to control their opponent, because that's what they spend more of their time doing generally. And I made the argument in the last video that people that train no-gi tend to develop a universal skill set, okay? And while I don't think that's entirely the case in the gi, I do believe there are aspects of the gi that are universal. It will vary according to how dependent you are on grips to achieve these techniques, but being able to have refined technique and pass can serve you well in a submission-only tournament. It could serve you well in a self-defense scenario. It could serve you well in a points situation, because you don't necessarily have to have a great offensive skill set in terms of submissions in order to win, right? Because at the end of the day, neutralizing your opponent is a massive component of winning. The other thing that I think no-gi students coming to the gi world will learn or notice is that I do a lot of times think that the gi game is something that you can age with better, okay? Because you can sort of neutralize physicality to a degree, it will always be a factor, but because the grips allow you to potentially slow your opponent down, slow the overall pace down, because there's less emphasis on wrestling and explosive takedowns and that sort of thing, I think it serves the aging grappler better than no-gi does, okay? Because no-gi, again, I made the argument in the last video, modern no-gi, I think, tends to be more associated now with sort of MMA gyms, with leg locks, heel hooks, that sort of thing. And as you get older, you might be more weary. Maybe you've had major knee surgery. Maybe you've slowed down significantly. Maybe you get tired faster. Maybe you're not as explosive and as athletic as you were when you were younger, okay? So I think the slower, more methodical pace allows aging grapplers to dictate the terms of the match much better than if you were just sort of rolling against a young opponent in no-gi, where even if you try to slow it down, it's much harder because you're going to be seeing more scenarios, more positions play out in a shorter period of time than I think you would in the gi. I think it also gives older grapplers an opportunity to work around things like injuries a little better, right? Again, because we can slow the pace down, we can stay in certain positions for longer periods of time, we don't have to rely as much on speed and explosiveness. I think it gives people an opportunity to sort of stay in positions for longer periods of time that maybe are less dangerous for them. Maybe they can get into positions that don't put as much stress on certain parts of your body or certain joints. Whereas in the more scrambling nature of no-gi, it's really hard to sort of protect certain angles and joints from impact. The last thing I'll say is the piece on culture, okay? I made a point in the last video that there are some cultural differences in the no-gi world, and I didn't want to give people the impression that I think that culture and tradition is a negative thing. Are there negative aspects to it? Of course there are, but there are also plenty of benefits to it. And I believe that the culture of the gi world and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in general is a great one. It's helped me get plugged into a community of amazing people across the world. It's sort of like a universal language. When you travel, people welcome you with open arms. I've met some of the greatest people I've ever met in my life through the sport, and because of that history and tradition. And so I think it's a great thing, and I think it's something that brings people together. And at the end of the day, I'm grateful to be a part of it. The only part I dislike about it is when, history and tradition and politics get in the way of adopting more modern techniques that are efficient and effective, simply because we don't, historically do things like heel hooks. I don't like that sometimes those sorts of things are looked down upon or frowned upon, when, in my opinion, as I mentioned in the last video, I think what makes jiu-jitsu great has always been this spirit of innovation and this willingness to adopt techniques that are efficient and effective. Okay, guys, so that is my long-winded rant on the benefits of training in the gi. And like I said, I do believe there is value in training both styles of jiu-jitsu, period. I think we tend to get too bogged down in one style is better than the other, one style is more pure than the other, and the reality is that there are lessons to be learned from both sides. Ultimately, I think if you want to become the most complete grappler that you can, you should train gi, you should train no-gi, you should have an open mind, you should respect some of the rules of the IBJJF, you should respect sort of the rules of the MMA community and the no-gi community. I think there's room for both of us to coexist peacefully, try both styles, because they will both help expose holes and weaknesses in your game, and that's always a good thing. Okay, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of it. Please leave a comment below if you liked the video. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if I left anything out. Is there anything that you've learned from training in the gi that maybe I missed? I'd love to hear from you. If you have a question that you'd like for me to try to address in a video response, you can leave it below. You can DM me on Instagram. I'm at pfedmusic. I'm here. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm all over the damn place. So find me wherever you can. Send me a message. I hope you got something out of this, and I'll see you guys in the next one.